My name is Mark Howden. I'm the director of the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. I want to welcome everyone to the ANU campus, those who aren't staff members themselves, and particularly a warm welcome to our US friends, particularly the Assistant Secretary, and also our friends from DQ, particularly Kushla. Before I start, in Australia, we have welcomes to country. We acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on who we meet. In our case, it's the Ngunnawal people, but also recognising that there's other family groups who have interests in these lands. Really importantly, from the point of view of climate change, our First Nations peoples lived through climate change themselves as we went from the last ice age to the current interglacial. So they've actually worked through the transitions that we're looking at, except of course, in the future, we're heading the other direction in terms of ice ages. We're heading towards a much, much warmer world. Now, one of the really important things in the topic for today, which is sort of the accelerating the transition to net zero, is an acknowledgement that we have common cause between our two countries. The US and Australia are both experiencing extraordinary climate extremes. We're experiencing extraordinary climate impacts, whether it's the cyclones or the fires and the smoke in New York that we all saw on our screens, are very similar to what we're experiencing in Australia. So we've got unprecedented levels of climate impacts. And of course, the globe has just gone through the hottest year on record. And the last 12 months, calendar months, is now over 1.5 degrees, the first time we've breached 1.5 degrees over a 12-month period. So we're seeing very rapid changes, which requires a very rapid response. So we know what's driving the changes. We know the things that we can do, at least in the first instance, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We're just not doing it fast enough. We're not doing it systemically enough. And that's what today is going to cover, some of the responses to that. So I'd just like to pass on the baton to Professor Kylie Catchpole from our College of Engineering to moderate the session. Welcome, Kylie.
Thank you very much. I might be moderating the session today. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Andrew Light, Dr. Andrew Light of Energy for International Affairs at the US Department of Energy. Since starting at the DOE, Andrew has led the department in initiating and expanding some 36 bilateral energy dialogues, forums, councils, and partnerships with countries from all regions of the world. His primary focus in these forums has been to increase work on clean energy and energy security. So please welcome Dr. Andrew Light.
Thank you. So you want me to speak from here? And then we're going to sit down? How did you?
You stand wherever you come from, sir.
Oh, all right. Over there? All right. Okay, fine. Mark, thank you very much for that overview, and Kylie, it's great to be here with you and Frank and the whole team. So some of you who might know a little bit, and you're disturbed if you know more about my bio than was Kylie just said, but nonetheless, I'm no stranger to universities. And it is an incredible honor for me to be at ANU. This is an amazingly important institution of higher education, research, learning. I have many friends who've done their doctoral work here. And it is a far-sighted, far-reaching, well beyond the borders of this country institution. It is a real honor, I must say, to be invited to be here at ANU. So, you know, I've now lectured at about 6 or 7 universities in Australia over the course of my career, but this is the first time at ANU. So what took you so long? I don't know why I had to, get confirmed by the US Senate to finally be invited. You know, once you get confirmed by the US Senate. I'll be brief because I really want to be able to hear questions from all of you and have a discussion, and I know Kushla does as well. So I'll just say a few things. First of all, I think that it is no understatement at all, and I think history will absolutely demonstrate that President Biden has done more than any other US president than any other person to advance domestic climate and energy solutions in the United States. And as someone who's worked in other democratic administrations in the United States, including as a built on and far extended our ability to work with you and others to do good in the world, to tackle this enormous challenge that all of us are facing today. Mark could have gone on and on and on and on about the impacts that we're seeing now. The modeling that many of us did, like when we were younger, that we thought was going to happen in decades is happening now. It happened 5 years ago. It's extraordinary, it's sobering, and we all have to take it extremely seriously. And I think that I would sort of say I'm extremely proud to be part of an administration and to be given the responsibility that I have at the Department of Energy, to be part of an administration that's taking the problem so seriously and to be working with so many good people who are doing that. Could we be doing more? Absolutely. Even with the hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that have been unleashed by our signature pieces of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, the CHIPS Act, and others that have allowed us to do this and hopefully to continue to do this work. Of course, we could do more because the problem is so serious. But the other side of it is also incredibly inspiring, is because what we now know, and now we can now see, and we're seeing that so quickly after we pass these landmark pieces of legislation, is that when you're intent on deploying as fast as possible, you also grow hundreds of thousands of jobs, good paying jobs, if you do it right. And if you take care of the communities who are in industries that are the legacy industries which have unfortunately caused these kinds of problems, then if you do it right, then you can actually create good jobs as you are unfortunately seeing other parts of the economy slow down. And I think this is important. This is an important lesson. Now, there's lots more that we all need to learn on that, but we're all committed to doing it in the United States in this administration. On the other end of the cycle, though, it's like we all have to also, other end of the scale, actually, we have to innovate as fast as possible as well. And that is where we all, I think, in communities like this, have so much to do. The International Energy Agency, for whom I serve on the governing board, as the U.S. representative on the governing board, estimates that only 3 of the nearly 50 clean technologies we need to achieve our climate goals are ready now and ready for that deployment. There's tons we can do with the tools we have. There's many other tools that we need at our disposal to actually get there. And I think if we get there, then we can do quite a lot. I'd sort of say that the watchword, I think now, which maybe we had an inkling of understanding, at least in the United States, and all of us did in 2021, radically changed with the Russian invasion of Ukraine now 2 years ago. And that is that we all knew that energy security and energy transitions, a clean energy transition, had to go hand in hand. We now know that that's as much an existential crisis as anything else. And it's very unfortunate to wake up to that reversal, almost historically, of where we are. I find it stunning, frankly, and I'll try not to say more about this, but I'm happy to do more in question and answer, that I have to answer questions to my children who are 14 and 13 about what's going on with respect to Russia that my dad was answering to me when I was that age, growing up during the Cold War. It's astonishing. But what Russia has done in their invasion of Ukraine, and absolutely unequivocally, do not doubt it, using multiple scales, is something that has demonstrated that energy security is absolutely paramount. But we believe that the key to energy security is energy independence achieved through a clean energy transition, which is something that cannot be weaponized in the same way that Russia has done with respect to the war in Ukraine. That's kind of the top line of how we're approaching this problem now. But the successes are there. if you look at the amazing amount of spending that we're doing in the United States right now, which is clearly an industrial policy aimed at solving this problem, we're yielding fruits. So already we have seen $160 billion worth of investment from the outside coming into the United States in order to meet and respond to our concentration of trying to grow clean energy solutions across the board. And I think if we are allowed to continue that, and I think that we've got the legislation to do so, then the United States will remain the good partner that it is proving itself to be right now for the rest of the world. Now, as was said at the top, one of my day-to-day jobs is to oversee over 30 bilateral compacts, relationships, partnerships, ministerial processes with different countries around the world. They are come in various shapes and sizes. Some of them are very constrained and focused. Some of them are broader. But the extraordinary thing about some of them is that they are with countries where we imagine that we can meet each other as equals, as partners, everywhere from the research side to the lessons learned on deployment side, on the policy side, to truly move things together. And so that is where Australia, I want to talk about our bilateral relationship with Australia, which is indeed extraordinary. When I was working on the part of the advisory team for the Biden campaign, we were trying to search through all the different ways in which we could not only institutionalize climate policy, but also for those of us who work on international affairs, make sure that there was a way in which you could reimagine foreign policy truly as co-equal with climate and clean energy policy. How do you put climate and clean energy policy at the center of foreign policy and do so in a credible way? We've done this with arms control, we've done this with trade over the years, we've done this with various things, but how could you possibly do that? And part of it is responding to the problem, but also part of it is to actively creating institutions where you work with partner countries that make that happen. So I think that is what the President and the Prime Minister did almost a year ago, last May, in creating our Climate, Critical Minerals, and Clean Energy Transformation Compact, or just the Compact for short. So the Compact puts climate and clean energy as a central part of our alliance in a way that it has never been before. And I think this is not just because you have two governments who are seeing eye to eye on certain kinds of priorities, but also seeing potential with respect to our resources, with respect to our workforce, and with respect to what we imagine could be a more sustainable, more secure future for both of our countries. So there are many different parts of it. Kushla and I will talk about a bunch of different manifestations of it. We have a task force on critical minerals, which is actually meeting on Friday with Minister King at the White House. So almost crossed, in midair coming here. Tomorrow we convene the Energy Security Dialogue, which has, 14, 15 different sort of topics that we're going to be talking about of incredibly substantive issues. There's a lot to be done there. We have got a lot to work on. I think all of you who are interested in these issues should look through the outlines of that and imagine yourself. Imagine what part of that you could work on, and not just because it would be working with the United States on something, but working with other countries around the world on the solution side of climate change. The other thing, and there's so much I could say here, and I really will try to keep it short, but the extraordinary multilateral relationship that we have with our Australia partners on multilateral issues. It has been a delight, frankly, of my time in this role to be working with our friends in DQ on a variety of different platforms. In the G20, in the International Energy Agency, we were great partners last year in convening the first energy ministerial that there's been in 9 years in the APEC process to try to help to do what we can to use our resources to bring countries forward. I'll just give you a couple examples of this. There's so many. The International Energy Agency is one. Now, the International Energy Agency, if you sort of study the history of it, which is now 50 years old, it's about 50 years old today. Henry Kissinger is really interesting because a colleague of mine, Jeff Pyatt, who's the Assistant Secretary for Energy, sort of my mirror at the State Department, Assistant Secretary for Energy Resources at our Foreign Ministry. We just had our IEA Ministerial, 50th anniversary IEA Ministerial in Paris just a couple of weeks ago. And Jeff brought a picture of actually the founding of the IEA 50 years ago, and you see Henry Kissinger sitting at one end of the table and a bunch of white guys, and that's it, right? Who are, but Hermit Kohl, some really legendary, titans of their time, but kind of, not a very diverse crowd. But nonetheless, they were responding to an energy crisis at the time, which were the oil shocks. And the International Energy Agency was created to respond to that, created a common form of oil stock holding and a common mechanism for releasing oil if needed in response to shortages. Now, the energy landscape on oil alone has changed tremendously in the last 50 years in my country and in many others. But to just give you an example of that really interesting and innovative policy mechanism, we utilized it twice at the very beginning of the Ukraine war to prohibit what we saw as the manipulation of oil markets that the Russians were starting to unleash, that were going to drive up the price of oil. And we released altogether 180 billion barrels of oil. Now, as someone who spent his lifetime, adult lifetime, working on climate issues, it's not something I want to put at the top of my resume. I'm responsible for helping to negotiate the release of that much fossil fuel into the world. But nonetheless, it did something that was really important. It made sure that there was not a shock to the system which would turn people off to the idea of a clean energy transition. And that was critically important. Now, bring that forward to today, and the International Energy Agency is no longer that kind of institution that's focused only on one kind of oil, one kind of energy commodity. It is now a clean energy powerhouse. And anyone who, like me, is an energy geek, if someone to sort of just corner you at a party and say, quick, what is your Bible? You'd say, oh, the WEO, the World Energy Outlook, of course. What else could be my Bible? It is like the big stat manual that I sort of then depend on for the rest of the year in answering any question or beginning to answer any question that I'm setting out to do. And that's produced by the International Energy Agency. That's the kind of institution that has the credibility. It's part of the OECD family. We would like to see it broaden, its scope and include many more diverse members, but nonetheless, it has this capacity to do different kinds of things, different kinds of analyses that have really helped to pave the way and help countries to be able to see, right, the possibility of what they could potentially do together. This year, for the first time ever, the International Energy Agency is going to open a regional center. And because of the leadership of Australia and the United States and a few other countries, I'm extremely proud to say that it will be in Southeast Asia. It will be housed in Singapore. Why? Well, because part of our global energy future, absolutely, as you all know, much better than almost any other country in the world, lies in this region. If you take the ASEAN countries as a whole, they are soon to be the fourth largest carbon emitter in the world. That's the downside. On the other side, they have the potential for creating the supply chains for clean energy outside an unfortunately narrow bandwidth of where those supplies come from in a way that is almost unparalleled. That's what we saw, and when with the visionary leadership of the Singaporean government, I think we'll all be there to help cut the ribbon and see that going forward. The last one I'll mention is the G20, which is really, since if you look at the history of the G20, it really has emerged well beyond the G7, obviously, because of the diversity of the countries involved there, as one of the most, I think, interesting, if not implementing institutions yet. It is nonetheless a bellwether of where we can see where countries are on a variety of issues in foreign policy, well beyond what was originally designed to do. It has an energy minister's track. So Minister Bowen is your representative to the G20. My boss, Secretary Granholm, is our minister to the G20. And it is in the last few years, because think about the countries there, including Russia, has really been tested in its mettle and its merit. The 2022 G20 was the first one after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The United States, Australia, Japan, the EU, UK, Canada, a few other parties, in response to the war, decided that every single ministerial track in the G20 had to include a reference to the invasion. There was no morally responsible way for us to sit down at the table, at a negotiating table with Russia, and say otherwise. We had to mention that and also call to task the responsibility, our outrage at it, and in the case of energy, the consequences of it. And if you look at a sort of a negotiated communique, and like it's got anywhere from 20 to 50 paragraphs or whatever in any ministerial track, what we essentially did by making that decision was making sure there would be one paragraph that would not close that year, that you could not close that communique, because Russia, of course, would never agree to it, and several other countries would not allow it either. The 2022 G20 was in Indonesia. Your government did an enormous amount of work with the Indonesian government to help to see a success there against extraordinary odds. And I'm really proud to say that of all the minutes, and so it was chaos that year, frankly, because many tracks just said, well, if you can't close one paragraph, then what do we care about closing the other ones? And so everything kind of fell off the table. But thanks to the dedicated work that your government did, and we did in partnership with them, and a very unusual cluster of groups, which I call sort of the alternative G7 that we put together, which included very few actual G7 members, we were able to create a common place where we could close every single energy paragraph in that communique, except for that one on Russia. And we were the only track to do that. And that seems like a weird thing, like why is it a success to get words on a page? It's because you're preserving the credibility of an institution that potentially could do something to help move something along. One of the big successes of this year's COP on the energy side was this incredible outcome of a commitment from all countries in the world to triple renewables and double energy efficiency by 2030. If you trace where that came from, right, it goes backwards to the G20 hosted by India, where they were able to preserve that language, and the G7 hosted by Japan the year before. And those are words on the page, but they're meaningful words, and now's the time in which we will build upon them. So with that, I'll stop and look forward to your questions.
Thank you for that very interesting and wide-ranging presentation. I'll now invite Kushla Munro to come to the stage. So Kushla heads up the International Climate and Net Zero Pathways Division at the Australian Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. Kushla is responsible for the delivery of Australian government's climate change policy, including international engagement in multilateral fora, net zero innovation and partnerships, and international strategic climate policy. So welcome, Kushla.
Thank you, Kylie. And I just wanted to also join the acknowledgement so graciously given by Mark at the beginning, and to thank our local custodians, the Ngunnawal, for caring for our country. It is a great honour to be here with Andrew Light. I first met Andrew, and it was during the COVID year, so he was online. I think we were doing a quad climate and energy innovation meeting. And it's been some hard times, as I remember. And I was absolutely struck then, as I continue to be today, by both Andrew's pragmatic kind of optimism, and you've seen some of this today, his shining intellect and just will. And that matters a lot, and it matters a lot when we're trying to do hard things as we are on the climate and energy transition front. So I was just going to make a few remarks, because I think the value is probably going to be from the discussion that we have with you, and probably hearing more from Dr. Light. But I did want to make a few remarks. So I think it's well known, Australia and the US have a long-standing and trusted relationship. And we've cooperated over a number of decades on the two long-standing pillars of our relationship. So defence, underpinned by the ANZUS Treaty, and also our economic pillars underpinned by particular our free trade agreement, but there's a lot more that goes into that. So the compact, as we refer to it, has agreed to elevate climate and clean energy cooperation to be the third pillar of the alliance. And that really does recognise, I think, both the significant opportunities, but as Andrew also put it, how do you reimagine foreign policy and how do you put climate and energy at the centre of that? So and there will be a lot of questions about, what does that really mean? And so when you think about the US compact, which was sort of agreed in May, but there was our Prime Minister's visit to DC in 2023. And so we did agree to advance a number of key areas. And so we have goals about how do we actually increase two-way trade and investment flows. And this is thinking about the collaboration on clean energy supply chains, establishing Australia-US Clean Energy Industry Council. Again, really important to make sure you have those enduring linkages. And then there are like more practical things about common challenges that we face. So, actually getting, funding work to share lessons and expertise on things like grid modernisation and also long-term energy storage. So the other parts to it, though, is about how do we work together to help shape sort of global conditions and the competitiveness of Australian and US clean energy industries. So again, building a pillar is going to take a bit of time, but one of the things that we're looking at is an MOU to begin with between the Department of Energy and of Clean Energy Demonstrations and Australian entities like the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. And again, this establishes cooperation, potentially, we hope, thinking about the funding or commercialisation of some of those critical technologies as well. And it's also going to be about things that will matter in terms of potential trade and the underpinnings of that, which would be looking at the accounting systems or the emissions intensity of products that we are both looking to potentially trade in, things like hydrogen, for example. Just to mention two other things, because it's not just about Australia and the US, it's about how we also think about our impact in the Indo-Pacific region. So there are things which we are doing, including an Indo-Pacific net zero transition bond, and thinking about how you mobilise funding for the small to medium-sized enterprises with that focus on clean energy transition. And then we know that climate change is a lot more than just mitigation. So adaptation and resilience in the Indo-Pacific. And one of the announcements that was made at COP last year was, the Pacific has been instrumental to designing a thing called the Pacific Resilience Facility. And so we recently announced a $100 million contribution to that. And similarly, US made a very significant announcement of their contribution at COP28. So it's both putting in the foundations and then finding those things that we can just sort of immediately cooperate and build upon. In the multilateral space, I would just probably touch upon maybe to sort of bookend a couple of things that Andrew said as well. One thing which I referred to where I met Andrew was working in the Quad. So the Quad is US, Australia, Japan, and India. And that is a particular focus about how you think about you diversify clean energy supply chains and what that may look like in the Indo-Pacific. So there are both statement of principles and I think about hard things which, are to do with ESG that can be very material, I think, in terms of the standards that are expected in terms of the trade of products. And how, we were able to work with the US and others to also help bring India on board with some language which they'd never actually ever accepted. And it was kind of significant for a number of reasons. And just, again, backing in what Andrew was saying about COP28 and a lot of that work, which, he said you could track back to G7, G20 language, that focus on the transition away from both fossil fuels, but also the tripling of renewables and doubling of energy efficiency, kind of have the fingerprints of how we've worked together, but also leaders like Andrew Light and how he has continued to think strategically and push these outcomes, which again, when you're working in the multilateral space, sometimes it feels like a game of inches and sometimes you're going backwards. But that incrementalism and when and how you can take that and bank that is critically important, and then probably defend it as well. So just in conclusion, just so grateful for the opportunities to speak today, but also that foundational relationship that we have with the US. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kushla. So our final speaker for today will make a few remarks and then we'll move to the question and answer part of the session. So Frank Jotzo is Professor of Climate Change Economics at ANU's Crawford School of Public Policy. He's also Head of Energy at the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, and a lead author with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and currently leading Australia's carbon leakage review for the Australian government. Thank you, Frank.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andrew and Kushla. It's wonderful to hear your big picture reflections here. I won't say much. I just want to put a few topics into the room for our conversation. And firstly, I mean, to have climate change and energy as the third pillar, actually, of such an important bilateral relationship tells you something about the importance of international collaboration on these issues. Now, what's the outlook for coming to terms with climate change, and specifically the outlook for remaining below 2 degrees as per Paris Agreement? Now, I can tell you in the economic analysis of all of this, the picture, the outlook for staying below 2 degrees is now probably better than it was assessed to be 15 or 20 years ago. So if you think back to Nick Stern's review, Climate Change Economics Review 2006 for the UK, and really for the world in a sense, right? They looked at 2 degree and 3 degree scenarios and effectively sort of sidelined the 2 degree for being too ambitious, not really possible, right? And now we're looking at, staying within a 2 degree envelope as a real possibility if we collectively put our shoulders to the wheels. Why the change? Well, firstly, we've learned that policy effort is actually possible, and that policy effort is rewarded with reduced emissions intensity and industrial rejuvenation and decarbonization and technological development and all the rest of it, where it is applied. We've learned that the process of making national pledges on climate policy, with all its ups and downs through the COP process and all of that, but by and large it works, and it has a function in kind of mutual reassurance of intent. And we've learned that it has an important signaling effect into business to facilitate investments. And secondly, technology, right? Technology has been our friend, and technology has been a tremendously positive surprise, right? And so if you backcast to 2005, say 2000, even 2010, right, you just simply would not have imagined, most of us would not have imagined the tremendous reductions in the cost for specific zero carbon technologies. Of course, solar panels first and above all, but also wind turbine system technologies, battery storage, electric cars, all the rest of it. All of this is coming much faster and much cheaper than we ever imagined. Why is that? Well, firstly, of course, R&D, and secondly, policies to support early deployment, right, and thereby scale up. And so, that can and should be, and I hope will be repeated with other technologies. And really, the forefront now is the decarbonization of industry, of industrial processes, of fuels, where molecular energy will still be needed for decades to come and into the second half of the century. And of course, Australia, as some other geographies in the world, has a tremendous natural advantage in these things, right? Lots of space, lots of solar energy, lots of wind energy, and also suitable investment and institutional and trade frameworks for that. And of course, that's the basis for the vision of Australia as a renewable energy powerhouse, including for export. And if you think, what's our contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions? Somewhere over 1% or thereabouts. You can then also say we're exporting fossil fuels, coal and gas. That's actually larger than domestic emissions combined. What can you compare that with, say, in 2050, 2060? Would be a largely decarbonized Australian economy and potentially a massive contribution to decarbonisation in other parts of the world through the export of zero carbon fuels and through the export of heavy industry commodities, energy intensive commodities produced using zero carbon energy. And that's the vision, how to get there. What's the role for government? Got some words prepared. Maybe we get to in the discussion in terms of a big question, of course, in this country, should we have ourselves an IRA? And so I think that's actually a very worthwhile topic for discussion. What do the very different circumstances, in terms of objectives as well as opportunities imply for policy frameworks to foster that shift in green industries? Thank you very much.
So maybe with a question to Andrew, Frank, you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a key pillar of the US policy. So maybe you could tell us your thoughts on, suppose we're in 2050 and looking back at the role of the Inflation Reduction Act, how would you see that's contributed to decarbonisation?
Yeah, so I think that we can actually see the impact already. There's in the International Energy Agency, there's a review that each member country has to do this every 4 or 5 years. 5 years, thank you. My rest of my brain is sitting so every 5 years, and it's a kind of a kinder, gentler version of the sort of the biannual review process in the COP. Which we also actually just went through as well. So we already are able. This is the thing, and I'm not kind of making a strong case to respond to Frank's provocation about whether Australia needs to do an IRA or not. But in our case, it's working. It's cutting through things quite quickly. I mentioned just one stat in terms of the external investments, but we are really able to sort of see already. And our goal is 55% reduction. When President Biden came in, he revised our 2030 target to 55% reduction by 2030 below 2005 baseline. And we're seeing a contribution through IRA to get to 40. Now there's a gap there, obviously, but the bill was a piece of legislation, so it wasn't designed analytically to perceive artificially an exact deadline or exact benchmark. It's 49%. During the Trump administration, I spent a lot of time with my work. I was mostly housed then at the World Resources Institute and also teaching. And at the World Resource Institute, we're mostly working on what could non-state actors be doing in the United States to sort of continue to sort of not completely lose the momentum when the administration was backpedaling, is the kindest way I can put it, away from what we've been doing in the Obama administration. And so I absolutely believe that with subnational action and some other indicators that will happen, I think a few other breaks on the technology side in terms of reduced costs, which we're intentionally working on now, in similar ways that Australia is through your emissions. I think that will be the impact there, and then we can sort of follow that model out, and you'll see. So when this review that's being done in the International Energy Agency, which will finalize and then defend in front of the other member countries in about 3 weeks, will show those curves continuing. Now, some of you, just to put, let's go ahead and get there. What happens if you don't have a continuation of the Biden administration? Well, one of the ways in which I think IRA is, and this will be, I don't want to irresponsibly speculate, but it is designed, and you can see this, to create communities that are tied to these energy solutions, which will be extraordinarily difficult for any administration to pull out, right? So take our hydrogen hub announcement. And this is one where I would sort of say that call it IRA, call it whatever you will. I think I am convinced, and I've been all in favor of different kinds of market based solutions over the years in different ways. I think to bring a hydrogen economy, a serious one, online as a real part of the solution, rather than something we're all talking about or as an input in modeling, we had to do something like what we did. We had an industrial policy which was injecting on the production side and the consumption side a massive amount of money to jumpstart that. Doesn't mean that everyone's going to need to do it, but I think that is what will help to bring to the world, is that injection and making, a bunch of things that were patient capital investments, right, to be something that are kind of more normal pace capital investments. And so ours was the naming and identification of these 8 $1 billion hubs around the country, looking at a variety of technology solutions, like some are producing clean hydrogen from renewables, some are doing from nuclear, some of them are doing from gas with CCS, some are doing from weird combinations. They're across the map, and that's part of our political solution to this, of how getting buy-in. Because of that injection of that money, and because of the production side that's going to be done there, and because of the tax credits on the other side, it's going to be extremely difficult for anyone to pull. They can try. The resistance at the state level, at the subnational level, is going to be enormous, because that will mean actually telling people this new job that you have in whatever part of the value chain there now no longer exists. And we're going to take it away, and we're not going to give you a really good explanation on why we're doing it. And we're actually going to make it really hard for anyone aligned with that government that's going to take it away for them to continue to get elected. So I think that I would sort of say that in the long run, we are institutionalizing something that, even with an administration that would be very different than the one that created this policy, is going to be one that will have some degree of durability, which can then be continued in successive administrations.
Right, very interesting point, and it's clear that hydrogen will play a key role and needs something to help it get to scale. I have a next question for Kushla, which is, what might turn out to be the main aspect of Australia's contribution to decarbonisation for global energy in collaboration with the United States?
Thanks, Kylie. I kind of hit upon it in terms of just some of the opening remarks, because there's interesting opportunities in terms of what might it look like to crack something really big on the large-scale energy storage. But there are also interests along, for example, supply chains. So for those who don't know, our Australian Renewable Energy Agency has a goal of how do you decrease the cost and efficiency of some of the solar panels. And we've done work which really does look in terms of what maybe, we won't try to do the whole thing because it's where we've got the strengths, particularly from the University of Sydney, in the solar cells, but the polysilicon, so you've both got, the base materials, you've got the technology, and it's where and how, potentially over time, linking in with some of the really great research and capabilities in the US, you could potentially see some of those breakthroughs. So there's sort of like, there's you can kind of say it's niche, but then at the same time, the fact of the US coming in with IRA and what that potentially means for the costs of some of these things coming down, and I think that's what Andrew was saying in terms of the benefits of that. And that sort of goes to, there's everyone gets criticised for everything. Australia's never criticised the US for bringing it. We always saw the advantage of it. What we have thought about in terms of what will that look like in terms of getting greater, both the research but also commercial two-way trades. Like this is kind of the point. This is the big game, the big shift that has to happen. But also, what might that look like for the supply chain issues also in the region and that diversification? So I think about it is both bilaterally, but also just want to reinforce how that might actually play out in the Indo-Pacific, which is a very helpful.
Yeah, and certainly that diversification of supply chains is really important. And the role of solar really can't be overestimated. It's going to be the major energy source in the world. Probably the projections are something like 50 to 80% of our energy will come from solar in the decades to come. I'd like to ask Frank now about what you see are the opportunities for industry policy in decarbonisation.
Yeah, we haven't really done much industry policy in Australia for a long time. We're probably a little out of practice, and I mean some things perhaps to be cautious about, right? And that is you want to stay quite close to your existing competitive advantage and actually, orient policy to support, decarbonisation and all the rest of it, and the emergence of renewable energy-based export industries. You want to first and foremost help industries actually realize the existing comparative advantage, right? Before you attempt to push comparative advantage outwards, right? And thereby get into a much more competitive situation with other geographies in the world, right? Where some things are being done better or cheaper, right? I mean, our wage levels are of course sky high, right? Our depth of human capital in some of these areas are quite thin, right? I mean, we're already talking about labor supply, skilled labor supply being extremely stretched simply by the domestic transition in the electricity system that we're attempting. And ultimately, of course, you want to be very clear what the objectives are. If the objectives are secure supply chains among friendly nations, if the objectives are regional employment opportunities and development, you want to be very clear about that and target those specific things and not necessarily use, say, a climate change policy instrument to also achieve those goals. And finally, from a public policy perspective, you will want to make sure that industry policy ultimately pays for itself, right? Economically, financially, to my mind, comes very, very much down to taxation arrangements, right? If you support now, what are the arrangements to actually recoup once these industries are properly profitable?
So now I'll open it to questions from the audience.
Thank you for coming. This is really fascinating so far. Imagine it's 2026 and Ukraine has won the war and established a secure border, and it's time to reconstruct it. How can we ensure that it reconstructs with green energy in a way that's linked to Europe, as opposed to reconstructing with dirty but cheap and available energy that might be easier? What policy instruments, what funds, like what were you seeing moving in that direction? Really interested in everyone's something.
You'd like to?
Andrew's job, yeah.
Yeah, this is when I got the call from the transition team, the Biden administration, between the election that Joe Biden did win and the inauguration, because there was this long stretch right between November and January, and so that's when the administration started building that's when the transition started, offering jobs to people, interviewing, for people for jobs, and I got this sort of like, oh, well, we'd like you to run international affairs. We'd like you to interview for running international affairs for the Department of Energy. And I because I'd worked at state and other parts of the government before in previous Democratic administrations, I never thought about going to the Department of Energy. I'd worked with the Department of Energy before. I certainly knew I wanted to stay in international work. I was like, oh, think about that. And then after a while, I was going, yeah, I mean, if the job is to get the U.S. back in a position of, if we can prove it, right, leadership on clean energy, I'm, one of the people who could probably do that, in the U.S. But they didn't tell me I was going to have to fight an energy war with Russia, so I was not prepared to do that. Even before the war started, this is hopefully helpful, is that we don't need to speculate about this. Ukraine has already signed on for this. So the biggest marquee kind of package that the Department of Energy, with the backing of like 8 other sister agencies using a consortium of 10 of our national labs, offers to any single country in the world to help them to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 is called Net Zero Wood. So you can kind of Google it and find it online. It's housed, the headquarters is at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado. And essentially, like to make long story short, it's an incredible thing to put together these big country teams that do a soup to nuts analysis of what it would mean for a country to get the right technological pathway to get to net zero by 2050, whether they actually embrace that target or not. But it's not just a report that we then spend years working on and throw over the transom. It's an engine that continuously spits out policies that are implementable for particular countries. At the same time, creating investment pathways from public and private and blended finance to pay for these policies to achieve this. And we work with countries in this meticulous way to go sector by sector by sector by sector. We started with a collection of countries at the Glasgow COP, when we first rolled this out. Nigeria, Egypt, Indonesia, Argentina, Chile, and Ukraine, before the war started. And we were focused really on two classes of countries, G20 countries for whom we thought are absolutely essential to get there, like Indonesia, essential, right, to get there. And then so-called middle income or rising income countries that could potentially become clean energy exporters in the region and pull an entire region with them. And the Ukrainians had the backbone to do this, and then the war started. And the most extraordinary, one of the most extraordinary things, I'm in awe of the Ministry of Energy there and my friends in it and what they've lived through and what they've done in the last 2 years, is that even in the midst of conditions we can't imagine, they've stuck with this program. So we continue to work on this program with them so that the idea of a net zero trajectory for Ukraine is already built into their own vision of what a reconstructed energy system in Ukraine will be. It's amazing. And there's tons of details on it. And, we can talk later and we can share with you, what we have available. At the same time, our office was responsible for getting 900 pieces of large scale, electricity transmission equipment shipped over to replace the grid that has been constantly being bombed since the first fall autumn season of the war. Even in the middle of that, they show up, they're there. I think that they're actually committed to this. And it's partly from that, one of the things that I said at the beginning, which is they get it, is that their key to energy security is an independent clean energy system. And they also see this not only as in their own interest, but as one of the commodities they can sell to Europe, right? Which we also managed to connect them to desync them from the Russian grid, which they were still part of just days before the war started, now to the European grid. So they've got a transmission system that can handle those exports. That's hopeful.
Yeah, very exciting to hear. Another questions? Yep.
Thanks, Andrew, for a very insightful presentation. I'm Ken Baldwin. I was actually Frank's predecessor as head of energy at ANU. So I agree with your general opening premise that energy security is going to increase as time goes on through the energy transition. No one in years to come is going to care what happens in the Straits of Hormuz, for example. But there are downsides, and so one of these is the fact that we're going to have an increasingly disseminated energy system. It's going to look much more like the internet centralized generator. And this opens up prospects for cyber attack. And in case people think this is a fanciful idea, it's already actually happened. And back to your Ukraine story about nearly a decade ago, when Russia invaded Crimea, the Ukrainian electricity network was brought to its knees by a malignant actor, whoever that might be.
Yep.
And so, given that conflict is changing, it's becoming more cyber-related. There are drones rather than people. So, how do you think this is going to play out in the long run, in terms of not just energy security, but the ability of the world to interact together through energy systems? Is this going to be a good thing because we become dependent on each other, we're interconnected, or is it going to become something that makes us much more vulnerable than we have been in the past?
I'll just repeat the question for the online audience. So about the risks of cybersecurity and increasing connection, and how do you think that will play out?
Yeah, well, I think part of the answer, Ken, is you've answered is it's already a danger. Even with the kind less sophisticated energy systems that we act in today. And we sort of saw this, frankly, in the US, again, early on in our tenure in this administration with the cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline in the US. I don't discount it as a threat at all. I think that part of the answer is in more distributed systems. This was, in the case of Ukraine, when Russia, I guess it was October 22, first intensively started the attacks on the grid system, which is one of the most diabolical ways. In fact, I mean, I don't want to make this whole thing about Russia, but it's, it's about what we're doing together, but it's just outrageous. I mean, it's diabolical. It's like, well, so Russia didn't attack the power stations; they attacked the grid, because that's much, much harder to defend against. Because you don't have, 10 to 20 big targets. You've got thousands of targets, right? And the nodes can collapse, and then the energy you're generating almost becomes a liability because you're gonna have to like force blackouts and things like that in order to keep some kind of stability. So I don't discount the point. I think it's a very serious point. I think that we've got to recognize it and get in front of it. Part of the answer is going to be distributed systems, hardening those systems. And I think then also finding ways in which we can actually overlay the kinds of resilience we need on cyber on top of the resilience we're going to need because of the stresses that grids are going to have because of climate change itself. And this is one of the things that we've got actually a collection of our national labs led by the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and Idaho National Laboratory. And we're working with 24 Central and Eastern European countries to actually help them to sort of see the overlap between those two and then actually map out the most critical nodes to do that, and then come up with a dynamic way of modeling energy systems so that you can quickly map alternative pathways when you get collapse of those nodes, right? And if it's more distributed, then you can hopefully contain the attack once it happens. So that's the short answer.
So we're running short on time, so we'll have one last question, and this is from the audience online. So we're seeing some tension between general support for clean energy, but community concerns at the point of local development of these projects. So how can these be addressed? How can these social aspects be addressed in rapid transition?
Well, we'll just let Andrew talk about it. No, we know, I was just speaking to you, Kylie, and I know that ANU is actually doing some great work on this as well, in terms of it's just not the engineering technical solutions. You know that the people and communities matter, and we know in our country that huge build out to 82% renewables is a really hard thing to do, and that goes to maybe if I can just put it in the context of things that I work more directly on, because we are thinking through not exactly what would be the equivalent of IRA, but the construct of the renewable energy superpower. And what would it look like in terms of there are areas of comparative advantage, but what's actually the kind of fair solution that you have with communities? And First Nations people, I think, is a really significant one. And so I don't think there's no country, well, also I'll say no liberal democratic country where this is not actually an issue. So these are things which we discuss internationally, but more importantly, in Australia, genuinely trying to get on, and it's the discussions that happen in the states and landholders, and then also reaching out into the First Nations community. So we know it's hard, but we've got to address it.
Absolutely. So unfortunately, we're out of time. It's been a really fascinating discussion. So I'd just like to thank Andrew Light and Kushla Munro and Frank Jotzo for a wonderful conversation.